California's coastline, with its stunning views, beautiful beaches, and redwood forests, could be threatened by something far more devastating than earthquakes or wildfires. Scientists say rising sea levels could be even worse. Rosanna Shaw is an environmental writer for the LA Times, and she's written about how the coast could look very different by the 22nd century. Thanks, Rosanna, for being here. And this is a really sobering new study, and it marries two kinds of models together. Tell us about it.
Yeah, the study is fascinating in a number of ways. We often talk about sea level rise in a very static way. So often when I talk to researchers and policymakers and the public, the way we talk about it is just if sea level rise X amount, then this area will be flooded or this area is at risk. If sea level rises X more amount, this much more will happen. And often the number that you hear that's the looming specter of sea level rise by 2100, the end of the century, is 2 to 3 meters of sea level rise or 6 to 9 feet. And that sounds like a lot, but also very abstract and also very far away. So what this study really did for the first time is take sea level rise by itself, plus storms, which we're all very familiar with in California, even in the last couple of months in Northern California and Southern California. So they took 100-year storms, 20-year storms, annual storms, typical storm conditions, and they put that on top of sea level rise, and what they found was that even a little bit of sea level rise, let's say 0.25 meters, 1 meter, nowhere close to 2 meters, plus a storm could give you damages and risks that are comparable to kind of this looming specter of 2 to 3 meters that we've been talking about but not really thinking actively about.
The numbers are staggering, aren't they? Tell us about the number of lives at risk and the land and property values.
Yeah, so the kind of highlight headline finding is by the end of the century, 2 meters of rise, 100-year storm. That's the ultimate extreme end of kind of what they're looking at. Looks at, I think the numbers were more than 500,000 Californians exposed to flood risks, more than $150 billion in damages, and that's, I think, 6% of the state's GDP today, in today's numbers.
And these models don't just predict storms, they also talk about beach erosion and cliff erosion and wave activity. I mean, you can just drive along Pacific Palisades on the PCH and see the cliff erosion there, and down in Orange County, the beaches.
Yeah, this model is so sophisticated. I mean, it's not just storms and sea level rise. They look at the evolution of the coast itself, which is cliff erosion and beach loss and all of the changing shoreline. And I mean, these are things that Californians are already seeing now, maybe not thinking about together. Capistrano Beach, I think back in December, had a series of winter storms and a boardwalk collapsed, and they had to haul in all these rocks to build a seawall to protect the basketball courts from disappearing into the ocean, essentially. And every time there's a high tide in a lot of parts of California, throw in a storm and it gets really crazy really fast.
Wow, and which areas of California would be hardest hit?
So that was really interesting. San Francisco Bay Area accounted for 2/3 of all projected loss and risk and damages. And a lot of it is because we built the Bay Area in a estuary, a marsh. And so think about kind of wetlands and then filling it in and then building on top of it. So it is sinking and flooding, and you know, they're naturally supposed to flood every high tide, and I think it's been really interesting to see how the Bay Area has defended itself against sea level rise.
Well, Long Beach is an estuary marshland too, isn't it?
Yeah, think of all of the marinas, any river mouth, so Del Mar with that river over there, and also Long Beach and Alamitos Bay. Kind of think of wherever a river kind of dumps out into the ocean, that's where a lot of marshlands are, and low-lying areas, and areas right at sea level or even below sea level.
Well, and staying in the Long Beach area, the port of Long Beach is the second busiest port in the country, and the Long Beach port, LA port combination is the 9th busiest port in the world. The economic devastation could be incredibly underestimated at this point, right?
Yeah, and I found this study so interesting because, you know, these scientists spent years taking what they were looking at with all of these models on sea level rise projections, which are so abstract, and then they translated it into economic impacts and social impacts. And so they mentioned the port as one of the examples, and if you think about how much, you know, cargo goes in and out every day from foreign, you know, trade and into the U.S. and across the U.S. and the rail lines and the roads and all of that. I mean, you just made a really great point of how much Long Beach and Los Angeles are an entry point for the U.S. to the world. And, you know, they didn't even get into this, but think about what happens if the port shuts down for 5 days because of flooding. How does that trickle down, or I think they called it a cascading effect, impact the rest of the country? Those are all questions that hopefully this study will prompt other people to start studying.
Oh, the economic devastation really could be complete. I mean, if you're selling something in Walmart in Arizona, it could have come from the Port of Long Beach. You lose sales there, you lose tax revenue. 51,000 port jobs in Long Beach alone. So you're talking about that as well. And something that your piece mentioned was if the railway floods, that's another, it's complete disruption.
Absolutely. I mean, we are all familiar with the iconic railroad along the coast, and we don't really think about what happens if a storm comes through with higher water levels and knocks that part of the rail line down or a bluff down. And those are all things that we really need to think about, because these are transportation arteries for California. And a fact that I think we've all heard at this point, California is the 5th largest economy in the world, and coastal California is so much of what California is.
Right.
I think the study said it was a very small percent of actual land in California, but the majority of Californians live along the coast and have property along the coast, and all our critical infrastructure are along the coast.
And just bringing it up to speed and, to grade it up to handle this sort of thing, just in the port area alone, they said it'd be $9 billion. But emergency managers and planning officials really need this, correct? This data that doesn't that actually gives them a more correct picture of the confluence of these two different models.
Absolutely. I spoke to the executive director of the California Coastal Commission, who has already been looking at the data and the modeling that this USGS team has been putting out for the last decade or so. And I think, often emergency managers look at 100-year storm projections and sea level rise projections separately, but they never really put them together. And when you put them together, I think the time scale is much different. They amplify each other. So I think that there is a lot of room for thought and planning and risk management.
And a sense of urgency, right? And a sense
Absolutely.
of urgency. Rosanna, thanks so much. Great
Happy to be on.
reporting.
Thanks so much.
Rosanna covers all things coastal in California, and we'll soon have an update on the Hollister Ranch access battle.